Jan Logie.
Talofa lava, Mr Speaker. The Green Party is voting against the Social Security Extension Young Person Services and Remedial Matters Amendment Bill. I just heard from the last speaker that the National Government has aspirations for young people, yet they seem to believe they're incapable of having aspirations or achieving them themselves. And I've got to point out that their actions do not match their words. This is the government that removed the training incentive allowance for higher level courses. That means that most sole parents who have aspirations to be able to get into well-paid jobs, to have a career that will support them properly and support their children, are now stuck in lower level education, funneling them into low-wage jobs where it will be very hard for them to get out of. That is not what I call aspiration. This bill we're opposing for many reasons. It is the flagship of the government's investment approach to everything, which is increasingly being critiqued by a wide range of organisations, from the Morgan Foundation to the Trade Union, Council of Trade Unions, to child advocacy organisations. And I would like to comment on some of the analysis from the Morgan Foundation, where they talked about what makes a data analytics or predictive risk modelling approach work, because that is what we're talking about. The government uses the language investment approach, but actually this is predictive risk modelling. And so it depends whether it will work, depends on three things: whether the people running it can recognise the data that matters, whether the programs that they then funnel people into are effective, and finally, whether the outcomes that it's all driving towards are the right ones. The Green Party is concerned that this model effectively entrenches this predictive risk modelling with criteria that are open to change. This model will be used to decide which young people will have more obligations put on them and exceptional scrutiny and supervision by the state. We've been told that the modelling is likely to consider educational outcomes, prior contact with child, youth and family, gender, reasons for leaving school. And we do know that while ethnicity is not a criteria, that 58% of young people who are in child, youth and family care are Māori. We know there is a bias against Māori in policing, and there is definite evidence to suggest a bias within child, youth and family. The Green Party is deeply concerned that existing biases within the system will be exacerbated by this initiative, and young people who have in all likelihood already had very negative experiences of the state will feel further marginalised. I raised this with an official during the Select Committee consideration of this bill, acknowledging that clearly they couldn't identify Māori as being a risk factor, because obviously that would be perceived as being racist, and asked if they were concerned that the effect of using contact with child, youth and family as a risk factor might still target Māori. The official said, "Don't worry, we'll get them anyway." This did not inspire confidence in me. And considering the very negative experiences of Māori with state services, real efforts need to be made to acknowledge the needs of Māori and address racism within the systems before creating another system that will channel Māori and identify them as risks and increase the state supervision of them. On this basis alone, the Green Party cannot support this bill. Further, this risk modelling requires increased information sharing between education, child, youth and family and work and income, and potentially other core social services in the future. While health information is currently not included, it could be in the future, without parliamentary oversight in that decision-making process. We're concerned at this level of information sharing for the purpose of placing increased restrictions and supervision onto certain groups of people, particularly when the policy is yet to be proven effective. We're starting to hear more and more stories of people not going to work and income for housing or other help because they're worried that their personal information is going to be shared with other people, their employers or other agencies, and that fear is stopping people getting help that they need. This potentially increases that fear and risk that people won't have confidence in the system and won't get the help that they're entitled to and that they need. And then, so we need to also, these is all about the data going into the system. We also need to consider the effectiveness of these interventions. And first of all, the first thing to consider is that we know that the numbers of young people who are not in employment, education or training have gone up under this government, under this type of model. And that the youth service is still a relatively new intervention and comprehensive data is not yet available to establish whether the service is even effective or not. That's not the time to be extending it to people who are actually considered adults in our law. When this government says that they're all about the data, they should apply that principle to their policy making and make sure they have the data before they extend any legislation. And the Green Party shares the view of the Salvation Army that, quote, the proposed extension of young persons services and the associated obligations and sanctions to 18 and 19-year-olds is a clear example of the state placing its policy objectives ahead of the legitimate rights of citizens, and that as a practice, this is unwise and unfair. I think, unquote. That is a very considered and measured commentary on what this is doing. Concerns were also raised by Kay Brereton of the National Beneficiary Advocacy Group about how the service currently operates. Clearly, we all support wraparound services that are strength-based for young people, but she pointed out that making young people's income dependent on meeting certain obligations fundamentally changed for worse the relationship between young people and the people that are supposed to be in the position of helping them. Community organisations, the people that are running these programs, have always been there traditionally alongside young people, focusing on their strengths and helping them build those strengths to move forward and achieve their aspirations. This puts those organisations into the role of police with the requirement to cut those young people's income if they don't meet their obligations. That is absolutely changing the structure of our society for the worse. Further, increasing international evidence shows that interventions that work best are less targeted and are unconditional and involve extra cash. So we don't support a measure that uses our precious resources to increase targeting and conditions and is strongly risk-based rather than strength-based. And finally, of course, the usefulness of all of this model depends on what outcomes you're driving for. This government has set up a system driving towards the goal of it all is to move people off benefits to save government money. It's not about increasing skills in our society. It's not about even giving people access to higher paid jobs or achieving their aspirations, or even as a very limited sense in terms of looking at children, access to quality, accessible childcare. No, it's only about reducing this government's, future financial liability to this government. That is not a society. That is not how we look after each other in this country, and how you move ahead is by actually taking responsibility and making sure people have the resources to participate and achieve their aspirations. We absolutely oppose this bill. And there's one more aspect of it that's deeply offensive, which is that it removes a right of appeal and limits the right of appeal and review to decisions about people only to their own benefit. And this has quite significant impact when there are shared custody arrangements. And in 2012, Social Security Appeal Authority, there was a case of a mother whose child was granted an unsupported child benefit payable to another caregiver and ruled that the law allowed affected people to appeal. This reverses and removes that right of appeal, and it only gives people the right to judicial appeal, which requires legal aid, and that is an offence to the rights of natural justice.
Great speech.